In the middle of the 19th century, infantry on the battlefield were still stuck with slow, single-shot, muzzle-loading rifles, and even a well-trained soldier could only fire 2 or 3 rounds a minute. Commanders were staring at horrific casualty lists from wars like the American Civil War and were desperate for some way to put more bullets into the air without simply throwing more bodies at the problem. It was in this world that Dr. Richard Jordan Gatling stepped forward during the Civil War with a radical idea. Gatling was an inventor, and what struck him most was that more soldiers were dying from disease than from gunshots. He convinced himself that if he could create a gun that fired incredibly fast, one man could do the work of 100. Armies could be smaller, and fewer men would be exposed to those deadly camps. That almost humanitarian logic that a deadlier weapon might actually shorten wars and save lives sat behind his invention of the Gatling gun in 1861. Mechanically, the Gatling gun system was a very clever piece of engineering. It used a cluster of barrels, at first 6 and later as many as 10, arranged around a central shaft and turned by a hand crank. As the operator cranked the handle, each barrel in turn passed through a full cycle of loading, firing and ejecting. A gravity-fed magazine or hopper on top dropped a cartridge into the breech of a barrel as it came into position. Then, a cam-driven mechanism slammed that round home and fired it at around the 4 o'clock position. As the barrel rotated downward, the spent casing was extracted and ejected out the bottom. By spreading the work across multiple barrels and automating the feed with cams, the Gatling gun could fire far faster than any single soldier at the time could even imagine. Early 6-barrel models could put out about 150 rounds per minute, with feeding being the biggest bottleneck, but Gatling kept refining it. By the 1880s, with better all-metal cartridges and a more advanced cam system, some models were firing around 400 rounds per minute, and there was even an experimental electric motor drive that Gatling tried, which pushed past 1,200 rounds per minute. However, the technology at the time was still too unreliable for this. But even with all that potential, the Gatling gun barely saw combat in the Civil War itself. A few forward-thinking Union officers bought a couple of guns out of their own pockets, like General Benjamin Butler, for example, who personally purchased a dozen Gatlings. But the official ordnance establishment was deeply skeptical. They thought rapid-fire guns were a waste of ammunition, and nothing more than unnecessary expensive inventions that would overload already strained supply lines. He clung to the belief that traditional muzzle loaders were good enough, and Gatling later described him as an old fogey who still thought flintlocks were the best guns. That conservatism, plus some early technical quirks, meant the Gatling was mostly ignored for too long to impact the outcome of the war. The Army did not officially buy Gatling guns until 1866, after the fighting was already over. The years after the war, though, proved just how lethal the design really was. Gatling guns were soon being bought and used by armies around the world, especially in colonial campaigns. The British, for example, brought them to Africa during the Anglo-Zulu War and used them with devastating effect against warriors still fighting with swords. Whenever a determined enemy tried a frontal charge, a pair of Gatlings could simply cut them down, showing for the first time in history the true concept of the machine gun. But by then, a completely different approach was about to take over. In 1883, Hiram Maxim had introduced his fully automatic single-barrel machine gun, which harnessed the recoil of a fired cartridge to eject and reload without any hand cranking. And within a few years, improved gas or recoil-operated machine guns based on Maxim's design could match or exceed the firing rates of Gatlings with much less bulk, one barrel, and smaller crews. With the arrival of smokeless powder in the 1890s, which removed the huge white clouds of smoke that black powder Gatlings produced, those new Maxims and their descendants utterly pushed Gatling's design aside. Militaries shifted to water-cooled, belt-fed machine guns instead of heavy, carriage-mounted Gatlings. By 1911, the US Army officially declared the crank-operated Gatling gun obsolete. However, no one at that time could even dream that it would take another global war and a completely new kind of problem to pull Gatling's old concept out of the grave again and create some of the most destructive forms of machine guns ever created. Now, surprisingly, jet aircraft changed everything. Let's explain this. First, the fighters of World War II were propeller-driven piston-engine aircraft. And they were, for the time, fast and well-armed, but their firepower came from autocannons with magazines and heavy machine guns that had reached the limit of rate of fire from a single barrel. Then they increased the number of these machine guns and cannons to boost firepower. But that added weight took a lot of space on the aircraft and again hit a limit. Then, after World War II, jet fighters were widely developed, and they made older fighters completely obsolete by how much faster they were. At jet speeds, an enemy fighter could flash through a pilot's sights in a split second. So if you wanted to actually hit an enemy fighter during a dogfight, and then for those rounds to cause damage significant enough to shoot it down, your guns had to throw out a ridiculous number of rounds in that tiny window. The US Air Force learned very quickly that its standard fighter armament of 650 caliber Browning machine guns just wasn't enough anymore, not just because of the rate of fire, but also because fighter jets were increasingly becoming tougher to kill with armor around key components. Those heavy machine guns fired about 800 rounds per minute each, but their bullets were now too small and too light to reliably tear apart tougher jet aircraft. And even with 6 of them together, the overall output was still not enough. Adding 20mm autocannons looked like an upgrade in punch, but these fired from low-capacity magazines, had jamming problems, and, most importantly, again had a low rate of fire. Engineers had run into a hard wall. A single-barrel machine gun or cannon had hit the limit of rate of fire, and they had hit the limit of how many of them they could mount, and still it wasn't enough. But then, someone got an idea. What if they revived the very same old system that had solved the firepower problem so long ago when there were still muskets? In 1946, the Air Force and Army Ordnance launched what they called Project Vulcan. They took Richard Gatling's 19th century principle of several barrels rotating around a central axis, updated it with modern materials and precision machining, and then drove the whole thing with an external power source, an electric or hydraulic motor, instead of a hand crank. Since a pilot hand cranking, it wouldn't be very efficient during a dogfight. Now, seriously, external power meant the gun did not have to rely on recoil or gas pressure to cycle, because feeding, firing, and extracting were mechanical. Like, imagine you have 6 bolt-action rifles and, as they turn around the axle, a mechanical system repeats the bolt action as long as there is ammo going in. So in simple words, that's something like how a Gatling worked. This freed designers to crank the rate of fire up to levels no conventional machine gun could handle. Multiple barrels meant no single barrel had to sustain all the rounds going through it, but instead, that load would be spread across 6 barrels. Engineers Melvin Johnson and Colonel Doc Howe dug out an antique Gatling gun from a museum in late 1945, bolted an electric motor to it, and ran live tests. That 60-year-old gun, designed in the black powder age, suddenly fired bursts at 4,000 to 5,000 rounds per minute without any trouble. Apart from the huge clouds of smoke from old-style ammunition, the test was a complete success and convinced the doubters that the rotary, externally powered concept could indeed work. By 1949, General Electric was already building modern prototypes for aircraft. Through trial and error, the result was eventually the M61 Vulcan, a 6-barrel, 20mm rotary cannon that would go on to arm almost every American jet fighter for decades. There were feed system problems to solve, but once those were worked out, the Vulcan was standardized and started appearing in frontline jets in the mid-1950s. By 1950, an improved version hit the target of 6,000 rounds per minute, which is 100 rounds every second of 20mm shells, which is absolutely not something to laugh at when it is going your way, and of course, more than capable of shredding any fighter jet of the time. A pilot could make a very short firing pass and still saturate the air in front of an enemy with a dense stream of 20mm shells, massively increasing the chance of a hit and giving them the solution to the problem they had been banging their heads against for so long. But not only that, it could also strafe ground targets, and the military soon looked at how this could be used beyond its original role. Once that was proven in 20mm, another question naturally followed. If this rotary system worked so well for big cannons on fighters, why not scale it down so lighter platforms like, unprotected transport helicopters entering the war could also use them? A smaller version would still deliver enormous firepower, but in a form that could fit on platforms where a full-size 20mm Vulcan would be too heavy. That line of thinking led straight to the 7.62 by 51mm, better known as the Minigun, effectively a miniature Vulcan that fired rifle-caliber ammunition. So that's why Mini, but the power coming out of it was definitely not Mini. By 1962, General Electric had working prototypes of a 7.62mm 6-barrel machine gun that could fire up to around 6,000 rounds per minute, just like its big brother in the jets. The US Army adopted it under the designation M134 Minigun, and it entered service around 1963 to 64. After roughly half a century in the grave, Gatling's concept had been resurrected in a way Gatling himself could never have imagined in his wildest dreams. However, Vulcan and Minigun were now for the first time to be tested in heavy combat, where they would really show what they could do. They would also evolve incredibly, to the absurd level. So let's now talk about it, and what really happens when you take 3 weapons, firing 100 rounds each second, then put 3 of those side by side and fire them at the enemy. When the US ramped up its involvement in Vietnam in the early 1960s, it introduced a new kind of warfare: air-mobile operations using helicopters, most notably the legendary UH-1 Huey, which was ideal to quickly transport troops into combat in terrain where there were almost no roads, and non-traditional army tactics actually worked. However, early in the conflict, these helicopters were either not armed at all or just lightly armed because they thought speed and agility alone would be enough protection against ground fire. Spoiler alert, it will not. As it turns out, half of the helicopters deployed in Vietnam got destroyed for one reason or another, enemy fire, of course, being a significant portion of that. Then, when they realized that a typical troop-carrying Huey was a sitting duck during insertions or extractions of troops, where it needed to hover low to the ground, and that even small arms fire could take it out, soldiers began improvising, adding machine guns on the sides, and soon the concept of the dedicated door gunner was born. It was much better than nothing, but the M60 machine guns they had were firing at a moderate rate of fire of about 600 rounds per minute, too low and not enough. So someone finally got the idea to multiply this rate of fire by 10 and try out these new things called miniguns. Some Hueys received flexible door mounts with an M134 minigun, replacing the slower M60, so the door gunner suddenly had a much more powerful weapon. Other Hueys, the so-called gunship variants, had miniguns fixed in side pods or chin turrets that the pilot could aim. By the late 1960s, the standard Army UH-1 gunship setup was the XM-21 armament subsystem, with a minigun on each side of the helicopter, in pods or flexible mounts, sitting next to rocket launchers. The new dedicated attack helicopter, the AH-1G Cobra, introduced in 1967, pushed this idea even further. Its nose turret could carry a minigun paired with a grenade launcher that the gunner aimed with a sight, and it could carry additional miniguns in pods on the wings. In short, the Huey and the Cobra were now fixed, no longer just flying trucks, but heavily armed gunships bristling with firepower, with the minigun as a centerpiece. This thinking created a completely new, dedicated attack helicopter concept, and because of it, the first attack helicopter ever, the Cobra, was born. However, this was still only the beginning, because they started mounting miniguns anywhere they could. As the war went on, the use of miniguns spread beyond Huey door mounts and Cobra chin turrets. The idea of a flying Gatling gun worked so well that the United States Air Force decided to build entire aircraft whose job was simply to pour minigun fire on the enemy. The first was the AC-47 Spooky gunship, a retrofitted C-47 transport plane equipped with 3 side-firing miniguns. Starting in late 1964, AC-47s flew slow, circular orbits over battlefields at night, using flares to light up the targets below while unleashing truly horrifying firepower. Each of Spooky's 3 guns could fire up to 6,000 rounds per minute, and the pilot could trigger them all at once or in sequences. It was said that a single AC-47 could saturate an area the size of a football field with bullets in under 10 seconds, and when Spooky arrived overhead, nowhere in that field was safe. United States troops besieged in remote outposts cheered the arrival of Puff the Magic Dragon, Spooky's nickname, inspired by the flaming arcs of red tracer bullets that looked like a dragon's breath, because the gunship could orbit a village or defensive perimeter and literally plow the jungle flat with suppressive fire. There are accounts of AC-47s stopping entire Viet Cong battalions in their tracks during night attacks, where enemy soldiers either ran or died when they were caught under the withering red rain from above. For the VC, the only warning was a distant drone and then the sudden streaking red arcs coming down. Many later said it was the scariest weapon they faced, even worse than regular aerial bombing, because it felt personal. The dragon could hunt you wherever you tried to hide. The success of the AC-47 led to more powerful gunships. In 1968, the twin-engined AC-119 arrived, and by 1969, the four-engined AC-130 Spectre followed, each carrying even more weapons. The AC-130 eventually mounted 20mm and 40mm cannons alongside miniguns, but the humble 7.62mm minigun stayed as a staple of these AC gunships for close support. In the dense jungle, nothing beat the ability to spray every square meter of a target area with bullets. One eerie anecdote from an AC-47 pilot described how, when all the guns were firing at night, the converging streams of tracer would set the vegetation on fire and even light up enemy soldiers caught in the open. It became a deadly light show that often ended fights immediately, as surviving VC simply melted away in fear. The psychological effect of spooky was immense. The Viet Cong soon learned that attacking an outpost under the watch of a circling AC-47 was suicide, and they nicknamed these planes dragon ships. Some testimonies from Viet Cong prisoners of war said that the distinctive buzzing roar of a minigun and the red, snaking tracer streams were so demoralizing that units would break off an attack as soon as they realized a spooky was overhead. As one American advisor summarized, enemy troops were killed, wounded, or ran away in terror, either way ending the fight whenever a gunship arrived. At the same time, miniguns were being mounted and tried out on all possible platforms, from gun trucks and tanks to armored personnel carriers and even boats. At that point, the minigun was no longer just a helicopter weapon. It was already turning into something much larger. Aircraft gunships were already some of the most impressive platforms in this whole story, so the focus stayed on them for a while. But the basic idea, a flying gun built for destruction, was pushed even further with one weapon in particular, the GAU-8 Avenger. The Avenger came out of a very simple Cold War idea in the early 1970s. If NATO was really going to stop Soviet tank columns, it needed a dedicated tank-killing aircraft, and that meant starting with the gun first, and then designing the aircraft around it. The United States Air Force's A-X program produced the A-10, and in parallel, it ordered a new 30mm rotary cannon with much more punch than the older 20mm Vulcan. General Electric's design won and became the GAU-8A, and from that point on, the A-10 and its gun were treated as one system, not as a plane with a gun simply bolted on. Physically, the gun system is huge. The bare cannon with its 7 barrels weighs around 280 kilograms, and the complete installation with the big ammunition drum and feed system is about 1,800 kilograms when it is fully loaded with roughly 1,150 rounds. That is roughly 1/6 of the A-10's empty weight. And the whole gun system is around 6 meters long. It sits in the nose, and the aircraft is basically wrapped around it. The nose gear is pushed off to the right to make space for the drum, and the cannon itself is offset slightly to the left, but the barrel that actually fires runs through the aircraft's exact center line, so the recoil is directed straight back along the axis. If you pull the entire gun system out while the aircraft is on the ground, the A-10 has to be supported at the tail because so much weight disappears from the front. The gun is hydraulically driven and fires 30 by 173mm ammunition from those 7 rotating barrels. In service, it runs at about 3,900 rounds per minute. It takes a fraction of a second to spin up, so the first squeeze of the trigger sends maybe 50 rounds in the first second. Then it settles at roughly 60 to 70 shells per second. Each shell is the size of a small bottle, not a rifle bullet. Ballistically, the system is optimized for about 1,200 meters slant range with the A-10 in a dive of around 30 degrees. At that point, the projectiles are leaving the barrels at roughly 1,000 meters per second, with several times the kinetic energy of a 20mm Vulcan round. In simple terms, this is a flying anti-tank gun. The ammunition is where the real killing power sits. The GAU-8 uses a family of 30 by 173mm rounds designed for it and for the Goalkeeper naval system. The main war rounds are armor-piercing incendiary with a depleted uranium penetrator and high-explosive incendiary for softer targets. There is also target practice ammunition that matches the ballistics for training. The depleted uranium penetrator is a dense rod that stays very stable in flight and is pyrophoric, which means it ignites when it slams through armor, spraying burning metal and fragments inside the vehicle instead of just punching a neat hole. The HEI round is built to fragment and ignite, giving blast and incendiary effects against trucks, infantry, radar sites, ammunition dumps, and buildings. In combat, these different rounds are usually loaded in a fixed combat mix belt, typically 4 depleted uranium rounds for every 1 HEI round. That way, every trigger pull sends both armor-piercing and explosive effects downrange without the pilot having to change belts. A typical war load is around 1,150 mixed rounds in the drum, even though the maximum capacity is higher. If you simply held the trigger, that entire load could be gone in under 20 seconds. In reality, A-10 pilots usually fire short bursts of 50 to 100 rounds to control ammunition use and barrel wear. Using aluminium cartridge cases and plastic driving bands reduces ammunition weight and barrel wear, which lets more rounds be carried and fired at that rate. The feed system is a big part of why the GAU-8 actually works on an aircraft. It uses a linkless, double-ended feed. Live rounds leave the drum, travel through the gun, and then the empty cases are pulled back into the drum instead of being thrown out. This avoids loose links and cases hitting the airframe or being sucked into the engines. It also keeps the aircraft's center of gravity more stable because you are not constantly throwing heavy empty cases overboard. The gun is rated at about 5mm 80%, which in plain language means that at the design range of around 4,000 feet, 80% of the rounds land inside a circle about 12 meters across. That is very tight for something firing from a moving jet at that rate. With that much metal coming out of the nose, recoil and gas were major engineering problems. At full rate of fire, the GAU-8 produces on the order of 10,000 pounds of recoil force, roughly comparable to the thrust of one of the A-10's engines. Because the gun is aligned with the center line and sits just below the center of gravity, the recoil pushes straight back instead of twisting the aircraft, so the jet does not stop in mid-air despite the usual myths. In reality, firing the gun bleeds off a few knots of speed and shakes the airframe, but the engines still produce more total thrust than the recoil, so the A-10 keeps flying just fine. The more serious issue in testing was the cloud of gun gas. The GAU-8 produces a huge volume of hot, oxygen-poor smoke that can be sucked into the engines at certain attack angles. Early test pilots experienced engine surges and stalls because of this. The fixes included changes in how the engines manage ignition during firing and adjustments to keep the worst of the gas out of the intakes. The A-10 and gun combination entered service in the late 1970s, but its reputation was really made in the 1991 Gulf War. The A-10s flew thousands of sorties against Iraqi forces, and the GAU-8 was used heavily alongside Maverick missiles and bombs. On paper, the gun can penetrate in the region of several centimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at typical engagement distances, especially on the flanks and rear of Soviet-era tanks. In practice, post-war analysis and dedicated test firing showed that only a fraction of rounds fired at realistic ranges actually hit tank-sized targets. That is normal once you factor in dispersion, aircraft movement, the small target size, and enemy fire. Of the rounds that did hit, depleted uranium penetrators were very effective against side and rear armor, suspension, and external equipment, producing a lot of mobility kills and catastrophic kills on lighter vehicles. Against the thickest frontal armor of late Cold War main battle tanks, performance was more marginal unless attack angles and ranges were ideal. Using the GAU-8 effectively also forces the pilot into danger. To get the designed accuracy and penetration, A-10s often had to dive from around 10,000 feet down toward low altitude, steepen the dive angle, and hold the trigger until they were inside about 4,000 feet slant range. That meant flying directly into the envelope of short-range air defenses and small arms. It is one of the reasons why gun runs could be both spectacular and risky, extremely destructive when they were done correctly, but at the cost of exposing the aircraft. After the Gulf War, the GAU-8 kept seeing combat in the Balkans, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. In these conflicts, the targets were mostly not full Cold War tank columns, but trucks, technicals, artillery, fortified positions, and personnel. The same gun that was built to tear apart Soviet armor turned out to be brutally efficient at ripping through light vehicles, bunkers, walls, and trenches. Short, well-placed bursts could cut vehicles in half, destroy artillery pieces, or saturate a small area with high explosive and incendiary effects, while still being more controlled than dropping unguided bombs. At the same time, the use of depleted uranium ammunition became controversial because those penetrators stay in the environment after the war, and there are long-running debates and studies about health and environmental effects in training ranges and former battlefields. Finally, there are a couple of spin-off and it did not work elsewhere angles that show how tightly this weapon is tied to the A-10. The same basic 30mm gun was adapted into the Goalkeeper naval close-in weapon system for ship defense, which proved the design works very well when you build a platform for it. On the other hand, a lighter 4-barrel derivative, the GAU-13, carried in a GPU-5 pod, was mounted under F-16s during Desert Storm. On paper, that gave an F-16A-10 levels of firepower. In reality, the pod flexed on the pylon, the aircraft were too fast and not optimized for low-level strafing, and the fire control software was not properly integrated. Accuracy was terrible, and the idea was dropped. That failure basically confirms the design logic behind the Warthog. The Avenger is at its best when the entire aircraft is built around coping with its weight, recoil, gas, and ballistic sweet spot, instead of just hanging it under a random jet, and the A-10 is exactly that kind of aircraft.